Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a beer, it's time for some PathOfExile discussion. So at the end of this weekend, we will have had 7 weekends and 6 weeks of the Expedition League, and I wanted to revisit the meta roundup that I did at the end of week 2, so a month ago. Have a look at the builds that are still performing well, and the builds that have fallen off in the interim. I also wanted to expand this meta overview to not just cover the questions of what builds are performing best, but also things like defensive layers and the like. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Firstly, a quick note as to my methodology. Grinding Gear Games publish The Ladder. This is a list of the top 15,000 characters by XP in each of the main leagues. So this contains also, as well as the 15,000 by XP, the top 15,000 by solo delve depth. There is a lot of overlap between these two groups. And so at the time that I'm recording this video, there were 15,882 characters between the two lists. Combined, these give an overview of the most successful build archetypes. And the website POE.ninja scrapes this data. It's also available for the hard modes, so it's not just softcore trade enabled. You can also get the same info for hardcore, you can also get it for solo self-found, and you can also get it for hardcore solo self-found. Harder game modes do sharply constrain what successful builds look like, and we'll get to that later. One thing that needs to be said though, some small percentage of players, even at level 96 plus, because to be on this list, on the ladder, you need to be level 96 and a bit now. Some small percentage of players will mess around with their build for a laugh, especially people that are quitting the league. So this means that you will find players sometimes that will allocate Avatar of Fire on the passive tree or use the unique necklace Zoth's Blood that grants it. But they will also use Brutality support on their weapon, on their main attack. And so this combination of skills or of effects causes them to be unable to deal damage because Brutality says you can only deal physical damage, and then at the same time that you've got Avatar of Fire, which says you can only deal fire damage. So you will find the odd person that messes around. You need a bit of experience with the game in order to filter those out, but they do tend to be a very small number. So just keep that in mind if you're looking at specific builds on the ladder. Next up, let's start with Ascendancy spread. And I wanted to start actually with a quick aside, which is a thought experiment. What would perfect balance look like? And the answer is not actually exactly the same number playing every Ascendancy. The answer is each player making an independent decision as to which Ascendancy they're going to play. And we can model that as being completely random. So you've got two players, Ben and Claire, and they're both choosing an Ascendancy. Ben's going to choose his favourite. Claire's going to choose her favourite. These are going to be completely independent events. And so you could model this by someone rolling a 1d19, so a 19-sided die, and rolling that 15,000 times to see the way that the spread ends up. Anyways, I thought I would do a little bit of mathematical modeling here and created a pie chart of what you might expect to see if you did have perfect ascendancy balance. However, because of a couple of mathematical complexities with it and the specific calculator that I was using for distributions, I ended up modeling it with 20 ascendancies just to make things a little bit easier. So I threw on the average extra number of people you'd needed, so 823 extra players onto the ladder in order to make the numbers roughly the same size. And this is what we came out with. 779 of the least played ascendancy, 893 of the most played ascendancy. That is what perfect balance would actually look like. It would not be 823 of each. That said, that's what the results would be if things were perfectly balanced. However, the reality is nothing like this, but it's also nothing like the extreme metas where we've had the massively dominant individual builds. So for instance, Legion is probably the example where this pie chart would look the furthest from what you see here. And there in Legion, you'd have sort of this half would be Cyclone Slayers. Then you'd have, Cyclone on other builds would take up a fair bit of the rest as well. So what do we actually have? No Ascendancy towers over all the others. This is the same as Ultimatum League, and it's something that means that this ends up being a more varied, in terms of Ascendancy spread, league than most of the last 4 years, so the 3.x leagues. However, it's far, far, far from perfect. We've got a clear 7-4-8 split here. 7 Ascendancies are doing well. These are the Necromancer, the Raider, the Gladiator, the Ascendant, the Occultist, the Deadeye, and the Hierophant. Then we have 4 that are doing adequately. These are the Berserker, the Assassin, the Guardian, and the Saboteur. And then we have 8 that are somewhere between bad and dumpster tier. So this is the Slayer, the Elementalist, the Juggernaut, the Pathfinder, the Champion, the Chieftain, the Trickster, and the Inquisitor. So that's the numbers as we see them currently. And this is what they look like on a pie chart. Now this is softcore trade enabled. How does this change if we start looking at other game modes? So firstly, we look at hardcore. Hardcore is where you would expect the Juggernaut to shine. It doesn't really shine there because it's just worse in pretty much every way than the Champion and the Gladiator. So when you look at hardcore, the Gladiator and the Champion rise quite a bit in popularity. The Assassin craters and most of the other Ascendancies fall off quite a bit. When you look at solo self-found, the Gladiator and the Saboteur rise considerably, but here the loss is much more focused on one class. And so the Gladiator and Saboteur's gain mostly comes at the expense of the Ascendant. We'll get to that later when we start talking a bit more about Unnatural Instinct and its effect on the meta. But basically, suffice to say that there is a duel that is incredibly powerful, but that is even better on an Ascendant than it is on anything else. And part of GGG's balancing sort of shenanigans they've been trying to work out over the last few years is that because Unnatural Instinct exists, there's a limit to how much they can buff the Scion, because buffing the Scion would then cause everyone in trade leagues to go and play it. Because in trade leagues you can get your hands on an Unnatural Instinct, at least if you're a top 2 or 3% player. And so there's this really difficult balancing game that they've been playing where the Unnatural Instinct has been kept at full power for a long time, but the Ascendant has been held down a little bit to compensate. And so in solo self-found, where Unnatural Instinct, the duel, is almost unattainable, this means that the Ascendant is very, very seldom played compared to what it is in trade-enabled leagues. So, as we say, harder game modes allow less versatility. But there's also the solo self-found factor where many builds are highly dependent upon specific uniques. See this particularly in Hierophants, a build where 79% of the softcore trade-enabled league players equip Soul Mantle. This means that for many players, not having a Soul Mantle means don't roll a Hierophant. And so you need to keep that in mind, that when an item is not really deterministically farmable, and Soul Mantle, like, yeah, you can use Gwenin at certain levels. Like if your character is around level 52, Gwenin has a reasonably good chance of giving you a Soul Mantle if you just keep pushing that gambling button, keep feeding her more and more Astragalis. You'll probably eventually get one. It is something that is much more difficult to justify starting a Hierophant on solo self-found unless or until you happen to come across a Soul Mantle. So you need to keep that effect in mind as well. So, based on this, I'm just going to arbitrarily give this league a 6 out of 10 for Ascendancy spread in softcore trade. And I'm going to give it a 4 out of 10 in those leagues that have either or both of the difficulty mods. This is actually a very high score relative to the past. Delirium Harvest, Heist, Blight, and Legion would score at most a 2 out of 10. Legion would be a 0 out of 10, Blight would be a 1 out of 10, Delirium Harvest and Heist would be a 2 out of 10, and that would just be because the aura stacking builds that were dominant at the top level were a bit less accessible, and so that meant that a lot of players felt, I'm not going to play that because I can't get my hands on the gear for them. So for this to improve further, for it to go from a 6 out of 10 to something better, the bottom 8 Ascendancies need serious help. This might be through game balance changes, but it might also be through the popularization of new builds. So, if content creators, if say, for instance, someone like MB Extreme were to discover some amazing Juggernaut build and popularize it, then that might make it so that the Juggernaut would jump up in popularity, even though there's no game balance changes associated with it. That said, I don't really think there's much to discover on the bottom 8. There's probably more to discover on the middle 4 than there are on the bottom 8. So the next thing we want to do is shift over to the question of defensive styles. So I have tried to come up with some sort of criteria for splitting up defensive styles within PathOfExile. This is actually really hard to do, and I'm going to get some cases wrong. But hopefully this is at least somewhat useful in giving a bit of a sense as to where we stand with defensive styles. So I've split characters up between dodge characters, which take acrobatics, phase acrobatics, and wind dancer. And because acrobatics ruins your ability to scale, block, armor, and energy shield, it's almost always paired with evasion. These builds do cap resistances and they do take a moderate amount of life. Then we have Chaos Inoculation builds, which stack energy shield and rely upon block quite a bit to mitigate damage. Then their energy shield pool to soak it. Synergizes very poorly with dodge. Then we have Glancing Blows, which is often used alongside Recover Life or Mana or ES on block, and a light investment in block. It's usually used alongside a shield, or sometimes in conjunction with staves that have block like Dust Dawn or Replica Dust Dawn. Next we have Max Block. This is a playstyle that sacrifices much more for defense than Glancing Blows does, but it's much more durable. And pretty much this is identified by characters that take the Gladiator's node Versatile Combatant. Next we have Mind Over Matter. This is a large mana pool alongside a decent life pool and either the Mind Over Matter Keystone or Cloak of Defiance, which provide a large effective health pool. They don't have all that many ways to mitigate damage, they just endure it. They often use Immortal Call or a high level cast when damage taken Steel Skin setup, although this is not always the case. And my character is using Mind Over Matter at the moment, and they are using manually cast Steel Skin. Next, we have what I term Molten Shell Life. So this is generally identifiable by the use of the skill gem Molten Shell and or its Val version. These builds typically have 10,000 plus armor using only relatively easily maintained buffs, and they use this to turn Molten Shell into something that is better than Steel Skin. They use this alongside a good life pool, fortified, block, and or endurance charges, and often at endgame they seek out Divine Flesh as well. This build was better without Molten Shell back in the days when Juggernauts were good, because if you were playing this as a Juggernaut, you would tend to use Immortal Call instead. However, at the moment, I feel like Molten Shell is the right way to play this build. That said, you can certainly do life builds that don't have that, and so that's part of the complexity of trying to allocate things into boxes. Next, we have Glass Cannon. This is how I typically play the game. Defensive layer is basically dodging the big hits, dodging the clusters of medium hits, and enduring the small ones. You still invest in life, you still invest in resistances, and you often use mechanics like Blast Freeze, which is a large cluster jewel that proliferates freeze effects, to preemptively freeze enemies. The last category is Extreme Glass Cannon, and this is the best style for deep delving. This plays the dodge approach, so dodge, which means acrobatics and phase acrobatics, and also takes Chaos Inoculation, and then makes absolutely no further investment in defense. No resistances, no life, no energy shield. These builds die to one hit from anything, but they can do extraordinary damage. Their defensive layer is to kill you before you kill them, and they're very good at it. These are the best builds in deep delving. So, defensive style popularity. Now, the numbers don't add to 100% here, as some builds fit more than one category, and the Glass Cannon estimate may be very, very wrong. I'm going to put that as a disclaimer. I also think that the Molten Shell Life category might be wrong as well. So yeah, like I said, there'll be some mistakes in this. This is a broad strokes overview rather than an exact criteria. One other thing I want to say, I use the word all a little bit here, like when I'm talking max block, all gladiators, all duelists and marauders. This doesn't mean every single individual, it means almost all. There is always someone being a troll. What we have here, 31% of players invest in dodge, 20% in chaos inoculation, 6% in glancing blows, 12% in dedicated max block, 12% mind over matter, 16% are what I term molten shell life builds, 6% are glass cannon, and only 0.2% are extreme glass cannons, which is the smallest that it's been for a very long time. This is the smallest that section has been since the Synthesis League 3.6, which is more than 2 years ago now. So this is the situation as it sits in softcore trade enabled. How does this change when you look at hardcore? In hardcore, max block is much more popular. Molten Shell Life is much more popular. Being both at once is even more popular again. In solo self-found, it's also impacted, but there I think the causation is actually the other way around. The nature of solo self-found makes the Spectral Shield Throw Gladiator one of the most popular builds there, but that is because Spectral Shield Throw Gladiator, just using the resources you can self-farm in 100 maps or so, can actually get itself a lot of damage. And actually, that's what you're going for, is the large amount of damage that build can get. The fact that it also is very defensive is really just a bonus. And so I think the popularity of the Spectral Shield Throw Gladiator mostly comes from how good its damage is, with the defensive layers that it has being a massive bonus. And that's the reason that Max Block is excelling in solo self-found this league. So in hardcore solo self-found, of course, these compound on each other, and you see even more of those gladiators. So that's our defensive layers out of the way. Let's talk about top performing skills. Firstly, a couple of things need to be said. There are two effects that distort these figures. So there is what you might term best builds, but then there are most popular builds. Why don't they exactly match up? Well, sometimes it's because the best builds don't work at low budget. Sometimes it's because a content creator puts out a build that looks cool and that is not necessarily the best build, but that people think looks fun, or just simply it's a well-designed guide. One of the best examples of this was the old Enki's Archwitch build, which was basically my go-to recommendation to every new player for a long time, was play the game by yourself until you stop having fun without a guide. Then as soon as you hit a wall, as soon as you start hitting resistance that's no longer fun to overcome, at that point, re-roll, but this time make a new character and copy the Enki's Archwitch build. Now Enki's Archwitch has now been retired, and Enki has put out a couple of new guides, which are also excellent. But this creates a situation where the information of what's available can sometimes cause a strong pull to a type of build that may not be justified by that build's strength. So there's no way that Archwitches were strong enough to justify the amount of people that were playing that build during the last sort of 16, 18 months of the game. But because the Archwitch had such a good guide for it, people did play it anyway. Likewise, there's a new and shiny effect. Absolution is a strong contender for the worst skill in the game. However, I had a lot of fun playing it at the start of the league because it was something new, it was something shiny, it was something different, and I brute forced it all the way up to 3 Watchstone Conquerors. So I got myself 16 Watchstones through using Absolution, and I had a lot of fun doing so, but that was a terrible build. And ultimately, that's something else that causes players to play skills, is just that they're having fun with them. Another thing that needs to be said is that this content creator effect is not limited to just the English language. There's great people making Korean language guides that don't get seen much by English speakers, and this causes a bit of a regional divergence. You will definitely notice that if you are trading a lot at endgame, you'll find that there are some items that sell, particularly if you get the right corruptions on certain items. As soon as you list them for sale, they'll get bought, but they'll get bought by someone that is that has a name that is Korean language. And this is just because there's popularized guides in that section of the world, in that language, that cause a lot of people that are playing the game in Korea to give those builds a shot. So, with all of that said, I want to list all the skills that got 100 or more people to level 96 plus, and I'm also going to list some variants of these builds. So this is going to total 30 builds that I'm going to list. But firstly, let's just go through a number of near misses. These 33 didn't make the top 30, but weren't too far off. Spectral Helix, Freezing Pulse, Volatile Dead, Ethereal Knives, Aura Stacker, Frostblades, Winter Orb, Stone Golem, Penance Brand, Scourge Arrow, Essence Drain, Rage Vortex, Lightning Trap, Summon Raging Spirits, Arc, Bone Shatter, Ancestral Warchief Totems, Herald of Thunder, Bane, Siege Ballista, Righteous Fire, Lancing Steel, Blade Vortex, Consecrated Path, Ice Crash, Cold Damage Over Time, which is mostly identified by the skill Vortex, Blight, Herald of Agony, Zombies, Lacerate, Ice Storm, Death Aura, Molten Strike, Glacial Cascade Mines. So each of these builds got at least 29 people to level 96 or higher. Also, Poor Soul Rend doesn't make this list. There are only 9 people at a level 96 or higher that are playing Soul Rend, but I do know of at least one person that did the Feared solo with it. So that's another example of a completely viable build that is nowhere near making even the runner-up page for this. So let's have a look at the 30 skills that are doing best in this league. The ordering on the left-hand side will be a little bit strange as some of these builds are variants of each other. And so I sort of worked this out by sorting each skill. So this means that Eye of Winter comes after Vile Lightning Strike, even though I've split it into Eye of Winter Mines and Eye of Winter Selfcast. That's because Eye of Winter, when you combine both of those, ends up with more than Vile Lightning. Ends up with less than Vile Lightning Strike, but more than Elemental Hit has. Also, a couple of these are under 100, and that's just because they're versions of other skills. So I separated out Elemental Hit, for instance, Elemental Hit Attack, and then Elemental Hit Totems are separate builds. So this is what the meta is looking like here. And you can see that there's the biggest section is Other. This is actually really strange. This is something that is not normal in PathOfExile for the Other skills section to be dominant. You know, to be bigger than any two sections put together on this, on the entirety of this setup. So we have Spectral Shield Throw non-crit, Spectral Shield Throw crit, Spectres. Spectres are the most popular build, but then again, some people combine both Spectral Shield Throw builds. I just think they're so different that they should be seen as different builds. Then you have Custom Crit Cyclone. Cyclone is a traditional build. Cast when channeling Cyclone, Forbidden Rite Totems, Forbidden Rite Selfcast, Aura Stacking Spark, Lightning Arrow Attack, Chaos Bowed skills. We have Tornado Shot Freeze, Shield Crush, Vile Lightning Strike, and then just a whole lot more. Eye of Winter Mines, Eye of Winter Selfcast, Elemental Hit Totems, General Scry Berserker, Flicker Strike Skeletons, Wander, Ice Shot, Exsanguinate Traps, Exsanguinate Spellcast, Carrion Golem, Ball Lightning, Ice Trap, Herald of Purity, and Stormbrand. So we have a lot of variety here. And this is just the top 30. Then we have all of these that near misses as well. What are we missing? We are missing something really significant here. We are missing Ignite. In 3.14, Ignite was in a mediocre place, but it was hard carried by the high numbers on a couple of support gems. Those support gems got the absolute crap nerfed out of them in 3.15, and as a result, Ignite has died. There is basically no Ignite build that's viable, and that's the reason that, and when I say viable, I mean good enough to make it onto this list of the sort of top 63. And so this means that Ignite is basically in a near unplayable situation right now. I don't see this changing without considerable balance help, whether that be a change to the base numbers on Ignite, similar to what was done with Poison, whether this be a reversion of the changes that were made to the burning damage support and the like. Without that, Ignite is gone. But otherwise, I think we're seeing a really good mixture of attack builds, of ranged build, of close range attack, of ranged attack, of long range attack, of point blank range attack, of spell builds and the like. The other thing that's underrepresented is self-cast spells. Not completely dead, but they're in a bad place as well. So those are the things that I think GGG should look at as far as balance goes, as well as possibly giving a little haircut to some of these top performing skills. Spectres being the worst defender, and Spectral Shield Throw being close behind, and Forbidden Rite Totems being close behind that as well. Sorry, that's Forbidden Rite Totems there. So, the next thing that needs to be said is the effect of Headhunter and Unnatural Instinct. These are two of the rarest unique items in the game, Headhunter being one of the rarest, and Unnatural Instinct being pretty rare as well. And players that are able to afford a Headhunter disproportionately tend to re-roll as a Raider or a Deadeye. This is because elemental attack builds with high movement speed benefit more from the ridiculous belt than anything else does. And so as the number of Headhunters in circulation increases, you will see a decrease in build diversity as a result. Secondly, Unnatural Instinct causes players who can afford it to be more likely to play an Ascendant, as a position that is near Shaper on the passive tree is utterly ridiculous for this duel, and all Scions are already near there. Additionally, Scions can combine it with Might of the Meek as well to make it even better. Now, this effect is minimal now for Unnatural Instinct, because almost every level 96 plus character can afford a 10 Exalt duel, and to get on the ladder and thus to be in this data, you need to be level 96 plus. But for 100 Exalt belt, it matters a lot. Additionally, there's a number of other really expensive chase items, such as Replica Forbidden Shaco, which are also factors that, things where a lot of people don't choose a specific build because of those items. Last thing I want to cover is the effect of hard modes. And so the nature of solo self-found makes some builds nearly impossible there. As an example, there are only 13 players in solo self-found on ladder levels that have Badge of the Brotherhood equipped. It's a very rare item with no deterministic farming method, and it's one that isn't great unless you can also acquire other rare items, usually 2 Void Batteries. There are 0 Dusk Dawns and 0 replica Dusk Dawns being used in solo self-found for the same reason. Almost no one has it, and of the few that do they really want to play the builds that it enables? It might be that you've got, someone that's desperate to play a replica Dusk Dawn build, but they aren't the person that's getting it. And then someone else gets replica Dusk Dawn, but they're like, you know what, I've got no idea what I could do with this, or I'm not interested in playing it. Or maybe they've played it before in a trade league. And so this means that builds that have little need for power uniques are disproportionately good and disproportionately overrepresented in solo self-found. In hardcore, it's similar, as some items do leave the economy, but middling rarity uniques like Soul Mantle are much more available than they are in SSF. In hardcore, some common boss drops are unnatural instinct level prices. Most notably, 6 exalts for Viridi's Veil, 8 exalts for the Saviour, 4 exalts for Atziri's Rule, which is mostly a meme item, people don't generally consider it very good, 10 exalts for Olroth's Resolve. And this combines to form a perfect storm of gladiators everywhere in these modes. Anyway, that is the meta roundup for 3.15 week 6. If you've got comments and questions, definitely fire away below. But I do believe that what we're seeing at the moment is a reasonably good meta that has a few flaws with it. We have no place for Ignite currently, less than we should have for damage over time builds in general, and otherwise things are looking pretty good, but there is a bit of a strong top end. And then there's also, there's a couple of top end skills that are definitely overperforming. So there's a few things that could be looked at balance wise, but I do think, and I think that this information does back this up, that whilst this is not a perfect meta, it's a lot better than some of the ones we've seen in the past. I like having 49% of people playing Cyclone and 41% playing Cyclone specifically on a Slayer, like we've had in the past in one league, or the league where we had 60% of players playing various types of aura stackers. So yeah, lots of work to go, but I do think things are looking sort of okay. And hopefully this list will give a bunch of potential options for your next build in the league. Anyways, going to leave it there. May your Varlobs have interesting results, and I will see you around.